Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. My name is Thomas, and I will be hosting this webinar called The Power of Block Data. Feel free to if you have any questions, to put them in the chat off to the right side. We'll get to all your questions at the end of the presentation. In addition, we will also be recording this presentation, and we'll have a PDF of the slide deck available, and we'll send that out to you within the next few days so you can view this presentation at your own leisure. Will be Dr. Chris Chmura, the CEO and Chief Economist of Chmura Economics, followed by Greg Chmura, our Chief Quality Officer, and a guest speaker, Kyle Kinateder, President and CEO of Midlothian Economic Development.
Thanks, Thomas. Many of you probably know us, Chmura, the creators of JobsEQ, but for those of you who don't, let me give you a brief overview. We provide a lot of different kind of economic data and studies and models. Most of our work, however, revolves around labor data. And along these lines, our desire is to help you as our clients make informed decisions to help your communities and your businesses thrive. We were founded in 1998. And we currently have offices in Richmond, Cleveland, and Dallas. We are about 45 economists, statisticians, data scientists, and business professionals with the mission of helping you grow your business and your community. We're driven by client satisfaction and success. We have a software side called JobsEQ. Many of you have probably used it or seen it. Then we also have the consulting side of the business. But again, we're driven by your satisfaction and your success, and excellence is really at the top of our priorities. And from that perspective, when we look at how we work every day, underpinning that excellence is very thorough and accurate data. We have a data governance group that is always checking the data, making sure that it's as accurate as possible. And then bottom line, it needs to be useful. So we package it in terms of our software and also in terms of our studies in a way that helps you to make the best decisions that you can. So with that as a background, now on to the presentation of the power of block data. Well, before we get to that, I'm going to give you a quick national economic update. We're seeing some encouraging economic trends. The question about herd immunity, will we ever get there? I'll end by talking about that. Then Greg will be talking to you about the mechanics of block level data, followed up by Kyle, who will give you some practical uses of how they use block level data in Midlothian, Texas. So first, the national overview. Across the globe, a recession is defined by 2 consecutive declines in GDP, gross domestic product. But here in the US, we have the NBER, National Bureau of Economic Research. Within it is a business cycle dating committee that looks at monthly data to determine when a recession begins and when it ends. And here in gray shaded, you can see where they declared that the recession was only 2 months long. It went from March to April. However, it straddled 2 quarters. And when you see the next chart in terms of GDP, it was first and second quarter when we were in recession. Of course, the economy was healthy pre-COVID. No one was expecting a recession, but the lockdown pushed us into recession. We lost all the jobs in the U.S. that we had created over the past decade. We're coming out of this fairly quickly. We've seen over half of the jobs come back now, but as we look at some more data with Delta, I would expect that in August and maybe September, we're going to see this job gain slow down a bit. On the right-hand side is income and consumption of consumers. This is very important because it makes up about 70% of GDP. So in red, you see income, where it jumped up as we went into the recession. and that was because of the CARE Act, some money that was provided to individuals to help them get through this period of shutdown. It came down, but then we've seen some more federal stimulus money, so it's jumped back up again. And in the latest month, we're looking at something more normal, just a percent or so increase from a year ago. Consumption, on the other hand, dropped off a cliff going into the recession because we were all told to stay at home, or those of us who could did. And individuals at that time were saving a lot of money. The savings rate went way up, and it wasn't until this past summer that people felt better about getting out and spending the money, going on vacations. So you see a huge increase in consumer spending on goods and services, and that is about 10% from a year ago, still a very, very strong number. At the bottom, another indicator that they look at in terms of when the recession began and ended is industrial production. So the output of utilities, manufacturing, and mining. And again, going into the recession, it dropped off a cliff. But in terms of percent from change from a year ago, we're seeing some very strong growth right now in the industrial sector. So then looking at GDP, the broadest indicator of economic activity, again, here's the recession, a huge decline. Previous to this recession, you see the Great Recession, which lasted longer, and up until the COVID recession was some of the greatest declines that we had seen. In terms of our forecast for the third quarter, we're looking at something just a little bit above 6%, and then still strong growth, around 4 or 5% going forward for about a year and a half. To give you a baseline on that, typically, if the economy is growing 2 to 3%, that's considered very strong. So because of the money that people have saved, because of all the stimulus, we expect this economy to remain strong for the next year and a half. Again, here's our forecast for the third quarter. With Delta variant, we might expect this one to be a bit lower. This has been an atypical recession, and given that, as well as the COVID hindrances, it has really been driving a strong labor market. So here you see the unemployment rate jumped. It's come down very quickly. The latest number around 5.4%. And then on the right-hand side is the participation rate. So all these gray shaded areas are recessions. The data goes back to 1950. And again, you'll be getting a copy of these slides in case you're having a hard time seeing some of these numbers are small. But as we go over time, you see in the 1970s and 80s, we saw the participation rate increase strongly, and that was because baby boomers coming into the economy and more women in the labor force. It peaked out and was coming down a bit when we get to around 2015. It leveled off, and then it plunged when we went into the recession and has come back a bit, but not to previous levels. And why is that? It's because some people are taking early retirement. Some people have fear of contracting the virus, so they're not going back to the labor market yet. Some people need to stay at home with their children, getting schooling through online. And then we have that additional federal unemployment insurance through Labor Day, about $300 more on top of what they get for the state. So that's keeping some people at home. But once we get to September, assuming that, again, the Delta variant starts to wind down, you should see the participation rate going back up. Another factor here, this comes out of the JOLTS data collected by the BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics, and they've only been collecting these data for about 20 years. Gray shaded areas, this is the percent of people quitting, that is quitting their job and finding another one. No surprise, in a recession, the quit rate goes down because you don't quit your job when the unemployment rate is high and when the economy is slow for fear that you won't be able to find another job. Notice the quit rate plunged as we went into the recession, and it started to come back up, and we hit a record level back in April. 4 million people quit their job in April. The quit rates was 2.7% of all people employed. It came down a bit in May and then back up in June to about 3.9 million people. So on the business side, we've got this double whammy going on where businesses are now starting to reopen, and so there's this increased demand for workers, and then workers are quitting to go and find new jobs, and so that creates the need for businesses to hire to fill those open positions. So right now, again, It's a very hot labor market, and the employees are in the seat of being able to ask for higher wages. More businesses are starting to allow employees to work from home, but the numbers are not as great as you might think, given what we hear from the media. So here, the BLS has added a question to its household survey, asking people if they have teleworked or worked from home in the past 4 weeks because of COVID. In July of last year, 26% of people said they did. That percentage started to come down, and it went up during the holidays when the virus started to increase in terms of across the nation. We saw some spikes, and then it has been coming down. And the latest data for July showed that only 13.2% of people are now working from home due to COVID. I would expect this number to increase a bit in August and September due to the increase in the Delta variant. That brings us to herd immunity. So we've been watching this carefully because, of course, as we see more people with the infection, we're going to see less people that are out spending. And the numbers were looking really good. Here we see an increase due to the holidays. It came down. This is the 7-day moving average. And in blue, you see the new cases. It spiked up a little bit, or didn't really spike. It increased a little after spring break, and it came down to very low levels. And now with the Delta variant, we're moving back up, and it's the levels that we haven't seen since late October, early November. So going forward, the University of Washington forecast is shown here in purple. Everything to the right of this line is the forecast as of yesterday. You see it peaking soon is what most medical experts are saying, and coming down, but notice it still stays elevated through the end of this year, back to levels that we hadn't seen since April. So in terms of the vaccine, right now, 59% of Americans have a single dose. That's as of yesterday. Only 50% are fully vaccinated. Again, the president was hoping that, or his goal was that by 4th of July, 70% would have a single dose. On average, we're seeing 739 doses per day being administered over the past week. That's up from around 400,000 or 500,000 a couple of weeks ago. So the Delta variant is causing more people to go out and get vaccinated. But the Kaiser Foundation, a poll that they had back in July, said that 3 out of 10 Americans are unvaccinated. 1 out of 10 are wanting to wait and see how the vaccine works, but 14% say they definitely will not get vaccinated. So we're closely monitoring this because, of course, that's going to have an impact on our forecasts. Here on this slide now, you see all the different states and where they stand in terms of those in darkest blue have the highest percentage that have been vaccinated. Those that are lighter blue, lower percentage that have been vaccinated. So in terms of the U.S. economy, we're seeing some really good growth right now. We expect the next year and a half to be good. But the last couple of weeks with this big spike we saw in Delta is certainly going to have an impact on growth in the next couple of months. Just as an example of how quickly things have changed in the last couple of weeks, Southwest Airlines this morning gave new guidance on their earnings. They're lowering their outlook for earnings over the next quarter, and they said it's because of weaker bookings and higher cancellations that they've been seeing just recently. And again, that's a change from what they were saying just 3 weeks ago. So again, in terms of the U.S. economy, we're seeing some good growth, good recovery. We expect to see a little bit of a bump in the road because of the increase in the Delta variant. So with that, let me turn it over to Greg. And again, please feel free to ask questions in the chat, and we will answer those at the end of this presentation.
Okay, thanks, Chris. And before I get into the block data, really, I should have added a slide here just to follow up on what Chris was talking about with COVID and the forecast, because I wrote a blog about this a few weeks ago, and you could check it out on our Chmura.com website. But basically how within JobsEQ, we have alternative COVID forecasts, because even though the recession only lasted 2 months officially, the ripple effects extend, far beyond that, and we're still experiencing that. And we still expect over the short term, employment is still down. It's not back to where it was prior to the recession. So we're still expecting faster than average growth over the shorter term just to get back to where we were before. And so within JobsEQ, we have a alternate COVID forecast just to help take that into account, because there could be a big difference in terms of what you're expecting in terms of job demand if you look at it with the COVID short-term forecast rebound versus just kind of taking a look at the long term. Okay, so onto the block data now. So I'll talk a little bit about the mechanics of it, so what's behind it, what it is, and so forth. And then we're going to move to Kyle, and he'll give you some real good examples of how he's using it. So first of all, with block data, the question is, what is a block? And so in the upper right, you see there, that's New York City, Manhattan. There's the park there, Central Park. And over to the right in the blue, that's an example of one block. So literally a city block, a rectangle, bounded by 4 city streets there. And so that is a block, but also a block could be a bigger area. So in the bottom left, we see this is Reno, and outside of Reno here to the southeast a bit, you see this blue highlighted area. So this is a lot bigger than a small city block, but this is still considered a block. So as a geographic entity defined by the Census Bureau, this is a block. And these blocks are throughout the whole United States. And they may be small like a city block, or they might be bigger like this particular area on the outskirts of Reno. Now here, this slide shows all the different geographical entities. And I want to focus first on this central spine. So we have the nation at the top and blocks at the bottom. So all of these entities are wholly contained within the other. So for example, here, starting with the nation at the top, you could divide the nation into states, and all the states could be combined to make up the nation. Underneath a state, you have counties. Counties can you be uniquely defining a state, and there's no overlap. A county doesn't overlap between 2 different states. And likewise, you could subdivide counties into census tracts. So some of you may be familiar and have used census tracts. And you could further subdivide that into block groups, and finally into the census blocks. So when we're talking about block data, we're talking about this very, very bottom group, the census blocks, which could be a city block, or it could be, kind of that larger entity. Now, the nice thing about these blocks is when you have this, you could create everything else. So all of these up arrows, or up lines, I should say, show you the things that could be created from this bottom unit. All right. Now, you'll see to the side here some other familiar things. So this one right here that I'm circling with my arrow, zip code tabulation areas, basically zip codes, but this is the more well-defined geography around a zip code that the Census Bureau uses. They call it zip code tabulation areas. In JobsEQ, we refer to these as ZICTAs, which is the abbreviation. But you'll see it's off to the side. The reason it's not in the central spine is because you can't, for example, take a combination of zip codes and build a county, because there's going to be some zip codes that overlap with one county and another. So if you have zip code data, you can't build counties or even states. All right, so it's something that's off to the side. The same thing here with places. So this very generic sounding entity, a place, is the name that the census gives to things like cities, towns, villages, and other what are called census designated places. So all of those entities over here to the side. And again, you're going to see that they're not in the central spine. So you can't take zip codes and define a city, for example. You can't even use census tracts and define a city, a place. There's no connecting line over here. The only way you could create a place is by its smallest unit, which is a block. So the block, these up lines show you all the things you could create once you have that block data. So for example, school districts, you can't create that using census tracts. You can't create that using block groups. You need blocks to create that. So that's why blocks are so very powerful. Once you have data for this unit, you could create everything over here to the side, which are very interesting things that you might want to analyze. The only thing you can't create, by the way, you might notice this one, sub-minor civil divisions. This is something that's only exists in Puerto Rico. Everything else has a line coming to it from the blocks down here at the very bottom. All right. So the important takeaway here is just to understand that, yep, the blocks here, the very smallest thing, even though you may have heard of, block groups and census tracts, some of these other things, but once you have the blocks, and only when you have the blocks, is when you could create and analyze all these other types of geographies that you might want to take a look at and analyze. Okay, so a few numbers around how many of these different entities there are. So in the US, there are about 3,100 counties. And when I say counties, I mean county equivalents, technically. Louisiana, they have, but they don't call them counties, they call them parishes. Alaska calls them boroughs. In Virginia, they have these independent cities in addition to counties, but all those are under the same umbrella of county equivalents. And that's the number here, 3,100 of those type of entities. There's also 33,000 ZICTAs, so those zip code tabulation areas, about 10 times the number. So when you go from county level to ZICTA level, it's a big increase, a 10 times increase in the complexity. Those places, those cities, villages, and so forth, there's about 29,000 of those. So adding in place data, it's about the same size of the ZICTAs, so adding in roughly the same size piece there. When you go to the blocks, there's 11 million of those. So it's a 10-fold increase, or I'm sorry, 100-fold increase approximately, from these entities right above them. So it's a big increase in complexity from the data management standpoint, and but it's also an increase in that granularity and the accuracy when you're trying to define regions. And of course, like we saw in this prior slide, it lets you define more precisely those other types of entities like school districts and so forth. Now, a few things about the quality control for these data. And it's going to vary when we talk about the quality of block level data, depending on what data sets we're talking about. So some data, we build them up from the ground level. And so the first example I have here, the NCES, the National Center for Education Statistics. So from them, they provide data on post-secondary schools and awards granted from those institutions. So those are provided for every institution. We get literally a street address for the college or university. And so we could pinpoint those down to the block level, even though they're kind of spread across multiple blocks. We pinpoint them to that central block where they're being headquartered, their campus headquarters, or whatever it might be. And so if we start with block level data from the NCES, it's a simple matter of just summing it all up from the bottom to create bigger entities. Census data is kind of similar. They have some population data at the block level from the decennial census, and then even the American Community Survey, while some pieces aren't available to the block level, they are available very low census tract or block group level. So you have those very small entities that you're beginning with, and you build up the higher entities from it, and it's all very consistent. So that's easy to manage when you're kind of building ground up. Now, in the other direction, though, we have to do this when we work with the employment data, because the employment data is very different. It's a top-down approach to a large degree. And I'm going to describe the reason. So the employment data is a hugely important labor data piece. Now, the most robust data source for employment data is the QCEW, which is the Quarterly Census of Employment and Wages. And that's provided by the BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, at the county level of detail. Excuse me. So those data, it's the most thorough source. It's data collected from the businesses themselves. and it's a census, so it's very thorough, and that's the data that we benchmark to because we know it's the gold standard for the employment data. Now, when we go down below the county level, we rely on other sources. So we, for example, zip code data, we look to zip code business patterns as well as other sources. So this plus means there's other things being added in here. Even for the county, I should have mentioned here, the county level, the QCW doesn't have everything like self-employed. That's something we have to get from other sources. So there's other things that we bring in there as well. For the zip code, so we bring in zip code business patterns as well as some other pieces. And that's a census, a U.S. Census product, and it's a very good source. It's not as thorough. It's not a census. It's a survey, and so we use it. But again, it's not as high quality as that county data. Same thing with the block data. So we use the loads data set, which is also coming from the Census Bureau. That stands for the Longitudinal Employer Household Dynamics Origin Destination Employment Statistics, which I wrote down here because I'd never remember that without spelling all that out. So we use also other sources for block level data, but that's one of the big ones. And likewise, again, there's certain issues with it that we don't want to try to build up from the bottom, from the bottom up. So that's why we incorporate these sources. But what we do is we benchmark them to the county. So we make sure that we hold true to the county level data. And then we use these other sources to create our best estimates for these smaller regions. And that's going to be very important because, again, being able to create these estimates is going to be really beneficial because really you can't do it without making those really refined, block level estimates to then, build back up. This is one other data set, and I don't want to confuse things, but I thought it was worth mentioning in here. It's kind of like a not applicable when it comes to block data. So also we provide data for job postings. This is something that we create in-house. We spider over 40,000 websites. We update this data daily. We extract text from online job ads and we compile them. So we analyze, this is an ad for a machinist in this particular area and so forth, a machinist versus a registered nurse or what have you. And we provide data on that. And it's very, very helpful data for getting up to the minute read on what's going on in the economy. RTI stands for real-time intelligence because, again, we update this stuff daily. And in this case, the way we query it in our software in JobsEQ is we query it at the county level of detail. And the reason why we do that is because a lot of times it's unclear from just the job ad exactly where the job is. So a lot of times they'll say, okay, this job is in Buffalo. And so what does that mean? Does it mean the city of Buffalo or does it just mean the general region of Buffalo? It's a lot of times unclear. So we can't make assumptions, and we don't want to make assumptions as far as exactly where it's at, given what they provide. So we only allow in JobsEQ these queries that are at the county level or higher. But what we do is we also provide all of these strings that we're looking at here. So all of these strings, these texts, are the locations in all those different ads. And so this will tell you that, okay, sometimes they'll give us something generic like Washington, D.C., but other times they're giving us a zip code. Sometimes they're giving us a neighborhood, the foggy bottom area here. Sometimes they give us an actual address. In this case, they actually give us a building, TWP headquarters. That's the Washington Post headquarters. So if you want to do the analysis as far as looking and examining for some more specific, more granular geographies as far as where these job postings, we're providing this so you could do your own research and examine a zip code or a city or a neighborhood as you like. So I wanted to add that in there about our job posting data, that even though we technically don't, break it down to the block level, you can do this type of analysis if you want to do some more granularity. So just to kind of summarize and clarify, what do we provide at the block level of detail in JobsEQ? What we provide is labor force data, and that's where we put the emphasis on. So industry employment. So the jobs defined by industry, and that's down to the 6-digit NAICS. So not only is it just the manufacturing jobs, not just the food manufacturing, but we go down to the 6-digit where you could, isolate ice cream manufacturing versus coffee and tea manufacturing and so forth. So very detailed information on those jobs, where the jobs are. Then we also look at the occupation employment. So are we talking about team assemblers? Are we talking about fast food workers? Exactly what are those occupations? So 6-digit level, 800 or so occupations. We have that not only by place of work, where they're working, but where also they live by place of residence. And that's really important because if you're looking for the supply of workers within a certain distance of a, let's say, industrial site, you want to be able to analyze it, not just by where people are working, but where they're living as well. So we have that both ways. And then population demographics. So that would be the people living in an area. What is, what are the demographics, the age, race, ethnicity, other defining characteristics of the population. So we have that as well. So all of these together to give you a real good definition of what the labor force is in an area when you define it by a collection of blocks. Okay, so how do we create the region to be able to query these data? So this is an example of a map, and this is a map we use as a tool to create the region. And these little circles on the side represent the ways we create the region. So we have a point and click tool where you can kind of select a block or a zip code one at a time. We have a type in tool where you could type in the name of the region. We have a drawing shape where you could, and this is actually what I did here in this example. So I drew this shape and it selected all the blocks within it. You could draw a radius, a 50-mile radius from a point. You could do a drive time. So for example, a 45-minute drive time from an industrial site, something like that. We also have a bulk upload. So if you have a list of blocks or zip codes or something like that, you could just pop them in to the system. And the way it works when we create regions in JobsEQ, custom regions, they're available instantly when they're based on counties or zip codes, because of the numbers. We just could provide that analysis instantly. With block regions, it takes about usually 5 to 10 minutes to compile those, just because we're working with 11 million blocks and we have to create that. So it's not something we have accessible, in 2 seconds, but we have to compile that once the request is made to create a region. Now, I'm going to give you a couple quick sample use cases that we've seen with our clients, and then Kyle's going to show you what he's been doing. So the one type of example we see a lot is when people create these regions that are smaller than the county level, and it's usually something like a city council district, a city ward, something like that, some kind of political boundaries, right? And those aren't well defined in terms of the Census Bureau. So those have to be defined locally, and those could change, right? So that's something that you could define and create in JobsEQ. We also see some types of these special economic development zones. So, there's opportunity zones. Of course, there's also different regions will have their own special areas that they have maybe incentives around in terms of development in those areas. So those are examples of things that we've seen a lot of people create so they could do analysis around the labor force in and around those areas. The other thing we've seen a lot of, and I know Kyle's going to talk about this more, is doing a drive time. So, okay, I'm going to analyze how many people can, commute to some kind of proposed site for maybe a new plant or an expansion. And defining this at the block level gives you a lot better accuracy. And in this example, I'm showing you, this is in Arizona, where the accuracy is really more dramatic, just because in Arizona you have zip codes that tend to be kind of large and counties that tend to be really, really large. And so when you analyze things at those levels, it's not nearly as accurate as if you could do at the block level. So in this case, this is a 45-minute drive time from downtown Cactus Forest, which probably none of you have ever visited before, but it is outside of Phoenix, here to the southeast of it. And if you analyze the labor force at the block level, you're going to see that there's 175,000 people who are living there. Now, if you do it at the zip code level, so just all of the zip codes that intersect with that drive time, it's going to nearly double. So 317,000 people. If you do the analysis at the county level, 2.7 million people. So not nearly as accurate as if you could do that analysis at that more refined block group level, which is why we've gone through all the trouble of creating this functionality for these types of analyses. And with that, I'll segue to Kyle.
Thank you, Greg. So I was asked to share a little bit of how we here in Midlothian, how we use the block level data. So quick little background, on one of the reasons that I think that this is so important. So I've been in economic development for about 9 years, have a rich academic background. Data is key, and as economic developers, as we work with prospects, we really wear this balancing act of, the salesman, but also their trusted confidant as they go through the site selection process. And so I'm a big believer that we are there as economic developers to help share, the information that we have and really find the right fits for our community. Ultimately, we want long-term partners in these companies. And so I've always been a big proponent of really, having the data that we're able to share with them and really find the right fit for the company and also for the community as well. And so actually, backing up, we're actually a relatively new customer, City of Midlothian, to JobsEQ. And really one of the key things that was holding us back was the block level data. As I'll go through in my example, having the ability to share the data at that block level really helps to tell the story and really the accurate picture of where the labor pool that the companies are going to use that isn't available if you have to pull it at a county level data or even zip code, as I'll share in a little bit later. And so, as we worked with their team and saw, and kind of went through and had some validation of the block level data, and really that's what it was for us to be able to, come on board and start using the product. We've used it multiple times with different prospects. We've shared it with our existing employers, and just feel very confident in the data that we've been able to share. So a little bit of background about Midlothian. So Midlothian, we are a suburb of the Dallas-Fort Worth area. We're located 30 minutes south of both Dallas and Fort Worth. We are located in Ellis County, so in a more rural county from within the Metroplex. Our community is extremely caught up in the fast growth activity that's happening in and around the Metroplex. Right now we're about little over 35,000 people, and growing at a 5-year average of 10%. Just really experiencing explosive growth. We also are a community that has a very strong, industrial base and industry base that really is extremely diversified. So you see, we have Gerdau, that is a steel mill. We have Martin Marietta, that's just off of this, that is a cement plant. We also have, data centers and high-tech activity with Google. We have distribution with Target, their distribution center. And so it's all of the prospect activity and mix that we have, really changes. And so for us, to be able to have and pull the data that we can go look at very specific SOC codes that prospects provide to us really is absolutely key in helping to find the right fit for our community and ultimately the right fit for the company, and give them assurance that when they move to our community, that they have the ability to have that long-term workforce that they need to ultimately survive and flourish in our community. So as Greg mentioned, one of the things that we really focus on is that 30-minute commute. So we've polled the census data that shows, live, work, and where the workforce within a specific area, where they're coming from. And that's kind of the thematic map that you see. The blue is a 30-minute drive time from our most, our highest concentration of available properties that's shown there with that purple place identifier icon. And so, ultimately when we run that 30-minute drive time and we put it in and the different geographic area that it pulls, whether you have the county, the zip code level, or the block level, you can see there's a significant difference, because when you run it at the county level, this 30-minute drive time, it's going to pull all of the counties that 30-minute drive time includes. And so if we jump back, you can see, our drive time really does not go beyond that, Dallas-Fort Worth line. But when we pull from the counties, you can see, it pulls all of Dallas and Tarrant County. When we look at the zip code level, it actually pulls more of those rural zip codes that we see as it gets down closer to Corsicana. And then at the last level, we're really able to pull very accurate data when looking at just the block level. And it pulls a little bit larger area, but we have, in strong confidence, be able to go to our prospects and share, that the data that we're providing is reflective of that 30-minute commute time, which in our area, that is, the standard. You're not likely to get employees outside of that area. And so the difference that we see in the data as we pull those, so for that larger area, it's pulling 2.8 million workers, which would be great, but that's significantly different than the 868,000 workers that we truly have at that block level. And so this is where, as economic developers, we want to be very, transparent and accurate, and, really help our prospects to see, the accurate size of the labor pool that they're going to be pulling from. One of the differences that we see, and it is illustrated here, the average wage, when you look at the Metroplex and the different pay as it relates to the different regions, there is a significant, difference that is only more prevalent as you look specifically kind of north to south. And you see that a little bit here with the average wage changing from 56,000 down to 54,000. And then kind of the last one that we are able to see is, in our growth, it went from, 1.3 ultimately down to 1.4, which is more reflective of that, excessive growth that we're seeing down in our area. Now, I don't have, the specific reports, but one of the key things as we go and we pull, the different data that we have, we're able to see the same information at the block level as we're able to pull, the specific number of employees that are employed in a specific SOC code or a very specific job title that they have. And then you can run and look at projections as far as what that employee pool will look like going out. I think it's up to 10 years is the maximum that you can do. And so, those are reports that are just very valuable in helping to, share with prospects and be able to talk through. And then also on our business retention efforts as well. Labor right now is difficult everywhere across the U.S. And we've used, this data to really help our existing employers as well, make sure that they're in line with where they should on wages and, helping them to kind of go out and find additional workers. So at a high level, I wanted to also just share a couple of the other areas that we provide and kind of use the data. So we have a workforce report that we actually are in the process of finalizing that report that will replace really the high level county level report that we currently are using. This report is key for us. Also in another areas, we work with our local high schools, and then we have a higher education center, which includes our community college and our university partner here in Midlothian. And we want to make sure that we're providing the right training programs, that we're teaching to the jobs that exist in our region. And then, as we've kind of talked about before, the labor and wage report, and really being able to go through and identify very specific job numbers and future projections. One of the other things that we do, and prospects have been very open in sharing this as we approach economic development really as a the teacher role. We ask them for the other sites that they're considering, and we let them know that we have the ability to run comparison reports for our specific location and a 30-minute drive from that site, and we do that same thing in the other communities, and it really helps to further evaluate kind of that workforce component and the differences in our sites. Helps us to better understand where we need to be more aggressive with our workforce providers to be able to go back and maybe, help them to, step up to the table and help with workforce development and training programs. And, in part that also kind of leads into the last one that we use. There's a what if impacts that you have the ability, to go in and it also polls, what if we added an employer with 100 jobs? And again, you can go through and kind of walk out each of those different pieces. But for us in Midlothian, it really is just the ability to show at that block level data, and that it most accurately reflects really that workforce within a 30-minute commute that is the standard in our area.
Okay, a few questions came in, and I'm going to take the first one or two of them here. So thanks for all your questions, everybody. And if you have more questions, please put them in the chat, and we'll get to them all. So the first question was coming from Chad. What is your data inclusion rules when drive times or radius cut across blocks? Is the data tied to the block centroid? So what we do, Chad, is when you're creating a radius or a drive time, and the analysis cuts through a block, what we'll do is we'll include the whole block within that drive time or within that radius. So they're generally small enough that we'll just assume that it's more likely that we want that block included in the analysis. So we'll include the full block whenever it's touched by a radius or a drive time. Another question came in here from Rick. Talking about JobsEQ, who recently added it. They want to know, is this included or an add-on, and would it be valuable for small rural communities? And so the answer is yes. So it is an add-on to JobsEQ. So it's not a part of all the packages. So sometimes it could be not there, but most of the time actually it is included, or people will add that in. And it's definitely valuable for even small rural communities. So if you do business outreach and you want to see what businesses are up to, it's a great tool for seeing what they're up to before you talk to them, as far as, okay, what jobs are they looking to hire? What skills are they looking for? You'll have a really good record, looking over the past several years of, who they're hiring. Are they increasing hiring? Are they decreasing hiring? What wages are they offering in some cases, or how long the jobs are out there before they get filled? So a lot of information as far as what those businesses are up to. So it's a great way to stay in touch with these businesses if you can't talk to them, or even in addition to talking to them. Another example I'd add is it's great for coordinating your local resources. So getting education and businesses on the same page. So for example, if a community college wants to start a program in, a certain skill, maybe a Python, a programming language, or some kind of certification, you could look at these job ads and see exactly who in your area is demanding the skill. Where would the jobs be? Which employers need this skill? And then you can make the connection between the school and the businesses to help get them coordinated so that you have the proper skills being taught to your labor force to have that more in balance, right, between the supply of labor, more in tune with the needs of local businesses.
And thanks, Greg, and thanks, Kyle. Very interesting presentations. I see Anna has a question here. Just curious, with some businesses choosing to mandate the vaccine for their employees, do you think they will start adding this information to their job ads? Greg, I don't know if you've taken a look at that, but while Greg is thinking about that, it's interesting that we have seen more job ads indicate that you can work from home. And in fact, I wish I had that slide, but I'll give you some general numbers. Like software engineers. We looked at this relative to before COVID, and the percent of ads that are allowing work from home in some of these jobs have increased 300%, 400%, 500%. More ads are saying you can work from home than did previously before the recession. However, if we look at it as a percent of the total ads that allow you to work from home, so we're talking about some of the software positions, it's about 20%. So 20% of the ads right now say that you can work from home. And again, we're looking at specific IT jobs. One that jumped out as very high was marketing and sales. It was about 50%. With that, Greg, are you able to answer Anna's question better? Have we looked at mandating the vaccine?
Right, that's a great question. So what we do in JobsEQ is you could query all these ads according to a keyword search. So just any kind of text that you might want to come up with. And this is a really interesting question. I didn't look at this before just a couple of seconds ago. So right now, in the last 30 days, there are about 9 million ads in the nation that were active over the last 30 days. And I did a quick keyword search for the phrase vaccine required. So there might be other ways that ads will talk about this. But again, I just did this quick off the fly, looking for that phrase vaccine required. And I came up with nearly 6,000 ads. And it looks like a lot of them are in education and healthcare. But yeah, in those ads that I popped into at least one of them just to look at it. And sure enough, that that ad talked about requiring the vaccine to work at that particular with that employer.
And Greg, that was across the nation?
Right.
Okay. Another question here. Can you share in follow-up email about this remote work from home data? Daniel asked that. And yes, we will add that slide. There are 2 slides, maybe a couple more when we send out the link. And Greg, I think Nancy Aird has a question for you.
Okay, Nancy. What is your data inclusion rules when drive times vary widely from 30 minutes to 1.5 hours for the same commute? Time of day, of week could vary. Right. Especially in Western Washington and Seattle. Right. Yeah. Another great question. So when we create regions in JobsEQ, you could specify the time of day for the drive time. So if you want to look at, time of drive time, 45 minutes at noon, or 45 minutes at 8 o'clock or 7 o'clock in the morning, you could do that. So this is really, it's kind of an art, and where you can use your own local knowledge of the conditions and what's reasonable as far as creating the best type of drive time analysis to capture what you're looking to for that particular operation. Because another thing too is even the type of business and the type of jobs being offered, that will affect the appropriate drive time. When the jobs are higher wage, people are willing to travel further than if they're lower wage jobs. So that's another thing that needs to be taken into account.
I think, on our side, we've seen that. And so as you're working with your prospects, one, having, an open dialogue with them of, this data that's available. We've had some that have said, no, we know people are willing to drive further for our positions. And so we can adjust it to what they're looking for.
Great. It looks like we've slowed down on the questions here. So, Kyle, thank you again for adding the practical usage of the block level data, and Greg for your explanation of the data and how we put it together. Thank you again, everyone, for attending. And as we've said before, we will continue to do these webinars as long as you find them to be useful. And please let us know some topics that you're interested in for future webinars. And as you see the infection rate with COVID going up, please be safe, but try to get out there and spend some of those savings that you have. Thank you again, and have a great afternoon.